The air in the crematorium was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the stifling weight of unspoken words. Alan stood by the polished urn containing his father's ashes, a hollowed-out man in a borrowed suit. Grief was a cold, heavy stone in his gut, a permanent fixture he was only just beginning to understand. His father, a man of calloused hands and quiet wisdom, was gone. All that remained was a small, struggling construction company and a legacy of integrity that felt like a poor inheritance in a world that valued so much else. Across the room, his wife, Clara, was not grieving. She was networking. Her laughter, sharp and brittle, cut through the somber atmosphere like a shard of glass. She stood with her brother Marcus, their heads close together, their eyes scanning the room not for familiar, comforting faces, but for opportunities. They looked at Alan, and he could feel the familiar sting of their condescension, even from a distance. To them, he was not a widower's son, he was an obstacle, a piece of a puzzle they were already rearranging to their liking. Later that day, their house filled with the low murmur of mourners. Alan felt like a ghost in his own home, drifting through conversations, offering weak smiles and mumbled thanks. Clara found him in the kitchen, her expression a perfect mask of wifely concern that didn't quite reach her cold, assessing eyes. She held a thick manila folder, tapping it against her palm with an air of practiced impatience. "Alan, darling," she began, her voice a syrupy sweet poison. "I know this is a terrible day, just awful, but there's a tiny bit of business we must handle. It's urgent." She spread a sheaf of papers across the granite countertop, a sea of fine print and signature lines. "It's just some tax filings for the company," she said breezily, gesturing vaguely at the documents. "My lawyer, a real shark, says they were due yesterday. You know how these things are." She pushed a pen into his numb hand. "Just sign here, and here, and here. Then we can put all this ugliness behind us." He looked at the papers, the words blurring through the haze of his sorrow. He saw legal jargon, numbers, clauses he couldn't begin to comprehend. He trusted her. He had always trusted her, even when some deep, dormant instinct whispered that he shouldn't. Overwhelmed by grief, exhausted by the performance of the day, and wanting only for it to be over, he did as he was told. He signed his name on every line she indicated, the scratching of the pen the only sound in the suddenly silent kitchen. Clara's smile was triumphant. She gathered the papers with the swiftness of a predator snatching its prey. "There," she cooed, patting his cheek. "All done. You've been so brave." She swept out of the room, leaving him alone with the dregs of the day and a chilling, indefinable sense of dread. Days later, while sorting through his father's modest apartment, Alan found it. Tucked away in the back of a wardrobe, beneath a pile of old flannel shirts that still smelled of sawdust and pipe tobacco, was a small, locked wooden box. It was old, bound in tarnished brass, with no visible markings except for the intricate, almost floral design of the keyhole. The key itself was in a separate envelope, heavy and ornate, unlike any key Alan had ever seen. It felt like a relic from another time, a piece of his father he had never known. He pocketed the key and took the box, assuming it was just a sentimental keepsake, another piece of a past that was now forever sealed away from him. The history of Alan and Clara's marriage was a quiet tragedy written over a decade. He had fallen for her vibrant energy, her ambition, the way she seemed to burn so brightly. He was a simple man, a carpenter, who found satisfaction in the tangible results of his labor. He believed in hard work, honesty, and the promises you make to people. Clara, he would learn too late, believed only in the appearance of success. She had married him not for who he was, but for a future she had projected onto him. She saw his father's construction company, Miller and Son Construction, as a stepping stone. When it became clear that Alan shared his father's humble approach to business, prioritizing quality, and his employees over aggressive expansion, her disappointment curdled into a relentless, soul-crushing contempt. For years, she had chipped away at his confidence with a sculptor's cruel precision. His opinions were quaint, his work clothes were embarrassing, his contentment with a simple life was a pathetic lack of drive. She controlled their finances completely, giving him a small allowance like a child, insisting that he was hopeless with money and that she was simply protecting them from his incompetence. He slowly began to believe her, his world shrinking until it fit into the small, demeaning box she had built for him. His father had been his only anchor. "Don't you let her dim your light, son," he would say during their quiet weekend lunches. "You have a good heart and a strong back. That's worth more than all the money in the world. Don't you ever forget what you're truly made of." But after his father's sudden heart attack, the anchor was gone, and Alan was adrift in a sea of Clara's making. Clara and her brother Marcus viewed the world through the same distorted lens of entitlement. They saw themselves as aristocrats trapped in the bodies of the upper middle class, destined for a greatness that was always just out of reach. They believed they were smarter, shrewder, and more deserving than everyone else, especially Alan. Miller and Son Construction was, in their eyes, a failing, mismanaged relic, a carcass to be picked clean. What they failed to understand was that they were the ones living on a foundation of sand. Their lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, the country club membership, was financed by a mountain of debt. They were posturing for a world they desperately wanted to impress, all while the credit card bills and threatening letters piled up behind closed doors. Alan's inheritance was not just an opportunity. It was their lifeline, their one chance to bail out their sinking ship before it dragged them under for good. A month after the funeral, the first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived. It came in a crisp, white envelope delivered by a courier. Alan signed for it, his brow furrowing at the legal letterhead. He opened it, his eyes scanning the formal, merciless text. It was a formal notice of eviction. He was being ordered to vacate his own home within 30 days. The property, it stated, had been legally transferred to a new owner. Confusion warred with a rising tide of panic. This had to be a mistake, a cruel prank. He found Clara in the living room, admiring a new, ridiculously expensive vase she had just purchased. He held up the letter, his hand shaking slightly. "Clara, what is this? It says we're being evicted." She turned, a slow, malicious smile spreading across her face. It was a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. She laughed. It wasn't her usual brittle, social laugh. It was a deep, ugly sound of victory. "You finally figured it out, did you?" She sneered, her voice dripping with scorn. "I was wondering how long it would take that simple little brain of yours to catch up." "What are you talking about?" Alan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Those papers, you idiot!" She spat, her facade of sweetness dissolving completely. "The tax forms you signed at the funeral. You signed it all away. The company, the house, everything. It's all mine now, and Marcus's. We're taking over." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from his lungs. The years of quiet humiliations, the condescending remarks, the slow erosion of his self-worth, it all coalesced into a single, blinding moment of clarity. This was not a partnership. It had never been. It was a hostile takeover of his life. The grief for his father was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, hard rage. It was the click moment, the sound of a sleeping giant finally stirring. He didn't yell, he didn't argue, he simply turned and walked out of the room. He went to his dresser and retrieved the old wooden box and the ornate key. He looked at the eviction notice again, then at the box. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Don't you ever forget what you're truly made of." In that moment, he remembered a name his father had mentioned years ago, in passing. An old friend, a lawyer who had helped him with the early setup of the business, a man named Thompson. While Alan was having his revelation, Clara and Marcus were celebrating. They were convinced of their own genius. They had a signed confession of mismanagement and a transfer of ownership. They believed Alan was a broken, powerless man who would simply crawl away and disappear. Their arrogance was a fortress, impenetrable and absolute. They began their pillaging immediately. They held a fire sale of the construction company's best equipment, selling it off for pennies on the dollar to a shady associate of Marcus's. They fired the company's longest-serving employees, men who had worked alongside Alan's father for decades, with a cold, dismissive email. They were liquidating Miller and Son, bleeding it dry to fund their fantasies. Marcus bought a new sports car, a screaming red beast he parked ostentatiously in the driveway of the house Alan was being evicted from. Clara was planning a month-long trip to Europe, first class all the way. They were giddy with their success, openly mocking Alan's gullibility to their circle of equally shallow friends. They were so blinded by their greed, they never once thought to look at the ground beneath their feet. They never imagined that the very foundation of their new kingdom was about to be ripped out from under them. The law office of Thompson and Sterling was not what Alan expected. It was located in a historic downtown building, the kind with marble floors and brass elevators that creaked like an old church door. The name on the frosted glass door sent a strange shiver down his spine. Sterling. He had seen that name somewhere before. The office itself was a sanctuary of old leather, dark wood, and the quiet hum of competence. Mr. Thompson was a man who seemed carved from granite. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened patiently as Alan, voice halting, explained the situation. He told him about the funeral, the papers, the eviction notice. He spoke of his father, his wife, the crushing weight of it all. When Alan finished, Thompson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. He took the eviction notice and examined it, his expression grim. "They were thorough," he murmured. "This is a transfer of deed, and it appears legally binding based on your signature." He then looked at Alan intently. "Did you sign anything else?" "She called them tax forms," Alan said, the shame hot on his cheeks. "She said they were for the company, Miller and Son Construction." Thompson's eyes narrowed. "And that is the official registered name of your father's business?" "As far as I know," Alan replied. The old lawyer was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured toward the wooden box Alan had placed on the desk. "Your father, William, mentioned this to me once, a long time ago. He called it his legacy box. May I see it?" Alan pushed it forward. Thompson took the ornate key from him and fitted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not a collection of old photos or letters. There was a single, thick, leather-bound ledger and a heavy document sealed with wax. Thompson broke the seal and unrolled the document. He read it silently, his eyebrows rising higher and higher. When he was done, he let out a low whistle. "My God, William," he whispered to himself. "You magnificent rogue." He turned his gaze to Alan, and for the first time the lawyer's stern face broke into a small, wry smile. "Alan," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound respect. "Your father was a very, very smart man, a quiet genius, and you, son, are a very, very wealthy one." The world stopped spinning and simply shattered. Alan stared, uncomprehending. "What?" Thompson slid the document across the desk. It was an official certificate of incorporation. The name printed in elegant embossed script was not Miller and Son Construction. It was Sterling Holdings Group. The sole shareholder and inheritor listed was Alan Miller. Miller and Son Construction was a decoy, Thompson explained, his voice a low, excited hum. It was a small, public-facing subsidiary, a hobby for your father to keep his hands busy. It was designed to look exactly like what it was, a small, local business. It was camouflage. He opened the thick ledger. The pages were filled with his father's neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't a record of 2x4s and bags of cement. It was a breathtaking list of assets. Global real estate holdings in London, Tokyo, and New York, controlling shares in emerging tech companies, mineral and resource rights on multiple continents, shell corporations and trust structures so complex they made Alan's head spin. "Your father built an empire, Alan," Thompson said, his tone one of awe. "A massive, private, global empire. He lived humbly because he didn't care for the flash. He cared for the game, for the building of it." He tapped the ledger. "Based on a quick assessment, you are the sole owner of a portfolio worth well into the billions. Not millions, billions." The confession Clara had tricked him into signing. It was for the decoy company, a company that, in the grand scheme of things, was worth less than the change in Sterling Holdings' metaphorical couch cushions. She and Marcus had staged a coup for a garden shed, completely unaware that they were standing in the shadow of a palace. Then came the most devastating revelation of all. Thompson, cross-referencing the ledger with a database on his computer, began to laugh. It was a deep, rumbling sound of pure, unadulterated irony. "Oh, this is beautiful," he chuckled, shaking his head. "This is poetry." He turned the monitor to face Alan. On the screen was a property deed. "The land your house is on? The entire subdivision? It's owned by a real estate firm called Apex Land Development, which," he typed a few keys, "is a wholly owned subsidiary of Sterling Holdings Group." "You're their landlord, Alan?" He kept typing. "Marcus's consulting firm. He leases a fancy office downtown, doesn't he? In the Beaumont Tower?" Alan nodded numbly. "Guess who owns the Beaumont Tower?" Another few clicks. "A commercial property group that Sterling acquired 5 years ago." The final, most exquisite piece of the puzzle fell into place. "And the bank," Thompson said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "The regional bank that holds all their fraudulent business loans and Clara's dozen credit cards. Your father bought a controlling interest in it during the last financial crisis. You, Alan, own the bank that is financing their delusion." They were not just thieves who had stolen a pittance. They were squatters on his land, tenants in his buildings, debtors to his bank. Their entire world, the one they had built on arrogance and deceit, was unknowingly and completely dependent on the very man they despised. They had handed him not only the motive, but the perfect pre-assembled weapon for their own destruction. Mr. Thompson leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in the silent office. He looked at Alan, his expression serious now, the thrill of discovery replaced by the grim reality of the task ahead. "So we have options," the lawyer said, his voice calm and measured. "We can make this go away quietly. We can unwind their fraudulent transfers, reclaim the house, and they walk away with nothing but public humiliation. They'll be ruined, but they'll be free." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Or," he continued, his gaze sharp and penetrating, We can bring the entire house of cards down on their heads. We can use the legal system with the surgical precision it was designed for. We can use their own actions, their own greed, their own signed documents against them. It will be loud, it will be brutal, and it will be absolute. Alan looked out the window at the city below, a city he now owned vast swathes of. He thought of his father's calloused hands, his quiet dignity. He thought of the years of being made to feel small, worthless and stupid. He thought of Clara's triumphant, cruel laugh as she told him he had signed everything away. The grief had been replaced by rage, and now the rage was crystallizing into something cold, hard, and unbreakable. It was resolve. He turned back to Mr. Thompson, and the lawyer saw a different man from the one who had walked into his office an hour ago. The slump was gone from his shoulders. The doubt was gone from his eyes. In its place was a chilling certainty. "I want them to understand," Alan said, his voice low and steady, devoid of all its previous hesitation. "I want them to understand what they've done. I want them to feel it." Thompson nodded slowly, a grim smile touching his lips. "I thought you might say that." He pushed a single document across the desk. It was a retainer agreement and a broad power of attorney, granting him authority to act on behalf of Sterling Holdings Group and its sole owner, Alan Miller. Alan picked up the pen, the same kind of pen Clara had thrust into his hand at the funeral, and signed his name with a firm, decisive stroke. The decision was made. The war had begun. The strategy session that followed was not about anger or revenge. It was about cold, calculated logistics. Thompson, a master of corporate warfare, laid out a multi-pronged attack. "We won't fire a cannon," he explained, pacing his office. "We will dismantle their world, brick by brick, using their own tools. Their arrogance is our greatest asset. They believe they hold all the cards, so they won't see the ground crumbling beneath them until they're already in free fall." The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Phase 1, financial strangulation. As the owner of the bank, Alan had the authority to recall their loans. Thompson would draft a notice of immediate recall on all business and personal loans taken out by Clara and Marcus, citing material misrepresentation and fraudulent collateral. The now worthless Miller and Son Construction. Simultaneously, all their credit lines would be frozen. Phase 2, professional annihilation. An immediate eviction notice would be served to Marcus's firm at the Beaumont Tower for breach of contract and association with fraudulent activities. This would not be a 30-day notice. This would be a vacate by end of business tomorrow notice enforced by building security. Phase 3, the legal guillotine. Thompson would take the very papers Clara had tricked Alan into signing, the confession, and file a formal criminal complaint with the Financial Crimes Division. "She thought she was getting you to confess to mismanagement," Thompson said with a predatory grin, "but what the document actually creates is a paper trail of her own conspiracy to commit fraud. She documented her own crime for us. It's beautiful." Phase 4, the final personal touch, eviction from the house. But they wouldn't just serve papers. They would let the financial collapse happen first, let the panic set in, and then deliver the final blow. With the plan set, Thompson picked up the phone. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His first call was to the president of the bank, a man who was technically Alan's employee. Thompson's voice was calm, professional, and utterly chilling. He identified himself as legal counsel for the bank's majority shareholder and issued his directives. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a swift, "Yes, sir, it will be done immediately." The first domino was about to fall, set in motion not by a roar of anger, but by a quiet, devastating phone call. The first steps of the plan were underway, moving silently and invisibly, through the systems and structures that Clara and Marcus believed they controlled. They were sunbathing on the deck of their own Titanic, blissfully unaware of the iceberg dead ahead, an iceberg named Alan. The first domino fell in the hushed, perfumed air of a Chanel boutique. Clara was treating herself, a reward for her own brilliance. She handed her gleaming black credit card to the sales associate with a dismissive flick of her wrist. The associate swiped it, and then swiped it again. A faint, troubled frown appeared on her perfectly made-up face. "I'm so sorry, madam," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "It's been declined." Clara's face contorted in disbelief, then rage. "Declined? That's impossible. Run it again, you imbecile," she snapped, her voice echoing through the silent store. The associate tried again, her hand trembling slightly. Declined. The store manager was summoned, a man trained in the art of placating the wealthy and furious. But after a discreet call to the bank, his expression turned to one of cool, unassailable politeness. "I'm very sorry, Madame Bellwether. There appears to be a systemic issue with your accounts. We cannot accept this card." Humiliated, Clara stormed out, her face a mask of fury. She jabbed at her phone, dialing the private number for her personal banker. It went straight to a generic voicemail. A cold knot of dread began to form in her stomach. Simultaneously, across town, Marcus was boasting to his two junior associates about a new deal he was about to close. His monologue was interrupted by the arrival of two stern-faced security guards from the building management, accompanied by a man in a suit holding a clipboard. "Marcus Bellwether?" the man asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Marcus nodded, annoyed at the interruption. "Your firm's lease has been terminated, effective immediately, a gross violation of contract terms," the man announced, loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "You have until 5 o'clock this evening to vacate the premises with your personal belongings. After that, the locks will be changed." He slapped a thick envelope onto Marcus's desk. It was the eviction notice. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized him. He sputtered, threatened, and blustered, but the guards were impassive walls of muscle, and the man in the suit simply stared at him with dead eyes. His associates watched, their expressions shifting from admiration to shock, and then to a dawning opportunistic distance. They were already updating their resumes in their heads. Clara and Marcus met at the house, their arrogance shattered, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched terror. "What is happening?" Clara shrieked, pacing the marble floor of the foyer. "My cards are all declined. The bank isn't answering my calls." "They're kicking me out of my office," Marcus yelled back, his face pale and sweating. "They said I violated my contract. There has to be Alan. That pathetic worm must have done something." "How could he?" Clara scoffed, the old contempt warring with her fear. "He's too stupid to order a pizza, let alone orchestrate this." They called their lawyer, the shark, who had drafted the documents. He was just as confused. He had received a notice that he was under review for ethical violations related to the Miller and Son transfer. He was panicking about his own career and was of no use to them. The cascade effect had begun. A notification from the bank arrived via email. All their loans were being called in, due in full within 24 hours. The sum was astronomical, far beyond anything they could ever hope to pay. Then came the official terrifying letter from the IRS. They were under a full forensic audit. Their carefully constructed world of debt and deceit was imploding. The news spread through their social circle like a virus. The friends who had once fawned over them suddenly didn't answer their calls. Invitations to upcoming galas were politely retracted. The whispers started at the country club, painting them as frauds and failures. Within 48 hours, they had become social pariahs. The tow trucks arrived the next morning to repossess the screaming red sports car and Clara's luxury SUV. The symbols of their stolen success were unceremoniously hauled away in front of their horrified neighbors. Throughout this spectacular collapse, Alan played his part to perfection. Following Thompson's instructions, he maintained a facade of bewildered sympathy. He called Clara, his voice laced with feigned panic and concern. "Clara, what's going on?" he asked, as if he were the victim. "Some men just came and took the truck, the one you bought me for my birthday. They said the payments weren't made. Is everything okay?" His feigned ignorance was the cruelest cut of all. It denied her the satisfaction of a direct confrontation. It made her feel utterly alone in her self-made disaster, screaming into a void while the man she had destroyed was seemingly worrying about a used pickup truck. She couldn't comprehend that the quiet, simple man she had dismissed was the architect of her ruin, watching from a distance as the trap he had set sprung with devastating precision. Her world was burning down around her, and she had no idea that Alan was the one holding the match. Desperation is a powerful, blinding force. Clara, stripped of her money, her status, and her friends, was left with only one tool she had ever truly mastered: manipulation. In a final, desperate gambit, she called Alan. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was now broken and pleading. She begged him to come to the house, their house, to talk. She was certain that if she could just get him in front of her, she could reassert her old dominance, play on his sympathies, and somehow fix this nightmare. Alan agreed. The final confrontation was set. The setting was symbolic. The house that had been his prison for a decade, a monument to Clara's ambition and his submission. He walked through the front door to find a scene of chaos. Packing boxes were strewn about, half filled with designer clothes and useless trinkets. Clara stood in the center of the living room, her hair a mess, her expensive silk blouse stained with wine. Marcus was slumped in an armchair, a hollowed-out shell of a man staring blankly at the wall. Clara's pleading demeanor vanished the moment she saw Alan. Her fear had once again curdled into rage. It had to be his fault. It was the only explanation that made sense in her solipsistic world. "You!" she shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. "What did you do? This is all your fault. Your stupid, worthless, bankrupt company has ruined us. It has ruined everything." She advanced on him, her hands clenched into fists. "I gave you everything. I tried to make something of you, and this is how you repay me, by dragging us all down with your failure?" Alan remained perfectly still, letting the storm of her accusations break over him. He let her scream until her voice grew hoarse, until her tirade ran out of steam, leaving her panting in the wreckage of their living room. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Then he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the vast room with an unnerving calm. It was the voice of a man who held all the power. "You're wrong, Clara," he said softly. "You spent 10 years treating me like I was dirt under your shoe. You thought my father was a failure and that his company was worthless." He took a step forward. "But what you didn't know, what you were too arrogant and self-obsessed to ever see, was that Miller and Son Construction was just a name on a shed, a decoy." Clara stared at him, her rage giving way to a flicker of confusion. "What are you talking about? The real company," Alan continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is called Sterling Holdings Group, and I own it all, Clara. Every last share." The confusion on Clara's face morphed into dawning, sickening horror. Her mind, quick and sharp when it came to self-preservation, began to connect the dots with terrifying speed. Alan pressed his advantage, his words like hammer blows. "This house you're about to be evicted from? I own the land it's built on. Marcus's office building that he was thrown out of? I own that too. And the bank that froze your accounts and recalled your loans? He paused, letting the weight of the final blow settle. I own the bank. He held up a piece of paper he had brought with him. It was a copy of one of the documents she had forced him to sign. And these papers, the ones you were so proud of tricking me with, I had a lawyer look at them, a real lawyer. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze cold as ice. He called them a confession, your confession. You documented your own fraud, Clara. You handed me the evidence I needed to destroy you. The truth, undeniable and absolute, hit her like a physical blow. The intricate web of her deceit, her sense of superiority, her entire identity, it all disintegrated in an instant. A strangled sob escaped her lips. Her face, a canvas of disbelief, crumpled. She collapsed to the floor, a heap of ruined ambition, her screams no longer angry, but the raw, animal cries of a trapped and broken creature. Marcus just sat there, catatonic, the reality too immense for his mind to process. At that precise moment, the doorbell chimed. Alan walked over and opened it. Mr. Thompson stood on the porch, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. His expression was grimly professional. "Clara Bellwether," one of the officers said, stepping into the foyer and looking down at the sobbing woman on the floor. "Marcus Bellwether, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and securities fraud." Alan didn't stay to watch them being handcuffed. He didn't need to see their final humiliation. His work was done. He turned, walked out of the house, and gently closed the door behind him, leaving the ghosts of his past to be swept away by the justice system. He walked down the driveway, not once looking back at the house that was never truly his home, and stepped into the beginning of his new life. The wheels of justice turned, not with the slow grind Alan had feared, but with the swift, merciless efficiency that billions of dollars and a mountain of evidence could buy. The trial of Clara and Marcus Bellwether was short and brutal. The prosecution, armed with the confession and a flawless paper trail provided by Mr. Thompson's forensic accountants, painted a devastating picture of greed and calculated deceit. Clara's courtroom hysterics and Marcus's vacant-eyed defense did nothing to sway the jury. They were found guilty on all counts, the judge, citing their complete lack of remorse and the malicious nature of their crimes against a grieving family member, handed down sentences that were far from lenient. Clara received 12 years in a federal penitentiary, Marcus 8. They lost everything, their freedom, their fabricated status, and every last dollar they had ever scammed. Their downfall was as complete as it was deserved. Alan, however, did not transform into the kind of man they had aspired to be. He did not buy a fleet of sports cars or a mansion in the hills. The immense wealth was a tool, not an identity. His first act as the head of Sterling Holdings was not to acquire another company, but to right the wrongs Clara and Marcus had committed. He personally visited each of the long-time employees they had fired from Miller and Son Construction. He not only offered them their jobs back, but gave them a significant bonus and a heartfelt apology for how they had been treated. He revitalized the small construction company, infusing it with capital but keeping its soul intact. It became his passion project, a tribute to his father's belief in honest work and quality craftsmanship. He then used the vast resources of Sterling Holdings to establish the William Miller Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to funding trade schools and providing scholarships for young people who wanted to learn a craft. He believed, as his father had, that there was immense dignity in building things with your own hands. It was through this work that he met Sarah. She was an architect working pro bono on a new vocational training center the foundation was building. She was brilliant, passionate, and had a kind, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. She was impressed not by his wealth, which he never flaunted, but by his quiet dedication, his respect for the workers on site, and his humility. She saw the man, not the bank account. Their relationship grew slowly, naturally, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values, a foundation of solid rock, not sand. The final scene of his old life story did not take place in a boardroom or a bank vault. It took place on a dusty construction site on a sunny afternoon. Alan, dressed in worn jeans and work boots, stood with his foreman, laughing as they went over a set of blueprints. He was no longer the hollowed-out man in a borrowed suit, but a man comfortable in his own skin, at peace with who he was. He saw a familiar car pull up, and Sarah got out, holding 2 cups of coffee. She walked over, her smile bright and easy. She didn't flinch at the sawdust on his shirt or the dirt on his hands. They stood together, looking at the rising frame of the new building, a structure that would help hundreds of people build their own futures. It was a quiet moment, simple and profound. It was a victory lap, not of wealth, but of worth. True wealth, Alan had learned, was not measured in dollars or stock prices, but in the character of a person and the legacy they choose to build. His father had left him more than just an empire of assets. He had left him a blueprint for a meaningful life. Power, true power, Alan now understood, was not about the cold satisfaction of revenge, but about the quiet, enduring strength it takes to build a better future on the foundations of integrity, kindness, and purpose. He had finally learned what he was truly made of.